1949 to the early 70s at least, touched about 2,500 neighborhoods in the United States, in nearly 1,000 cities, and kicked out of their houses over 1 million people. Of those 2,500 clear neighborhoods, over 1,500 of them were majority black and brown, which really underlined one of the, I think, sadly ironic themes that people mentioned, which was urban renewal is Negro renewal. And so I don't put too much into that more history. I recommend this included. But let me tell you where I started. Look at the models. So I started looking at the data as an architect. And I don't know if there are a couple of architects in the room. I don't know if you recognize this. It's a project from right after World War II called Fun City. And I don't know if it looks very fun to you, but architects think it's a lot of fun. And the main reason architects think it's fun is that this was designed for a theater that never got built. That was supposed to be an experimental theater. And the big idea was that they wanted to be able to change the scenery and the settings for their plays at a moment's notice. And so the building is like a big warehouse with all these pulleys and levers and strings. And then you just, oh, you need a new wall, like press that button. You need a new floor, like pull this string. And so it really became a niche for a place where the people who use that place were in control of that place. And so one of the things that for me is a constant theme is the struggle with democratic control of the built environment. How do we, as people who live in cities or things like cities, actually work together or fight together to decide how we arrange places where we live? And so this is kind of a beautiful image, and definitely the way I was educated as an architect is you kind of thought at the building level and not so much what happened beyond the buildings. Maybe I reached the limit of my remote control, so I'll go back over here. But one of the things that I learned, and I think a lot of people learned right outside of, let me try it from here, right outside of architecture school, oh thank you, is that certainly there's decisions that get made about how things get built and how cities, right, like get arranged, right? You've seen that? But it's not like everybody agrees on it. And so no matter where you go in the world, the cities, you can find people that fight. So that city is a good example. They are things that only are responding to many complicated group decisions and that are very much subject to the control of power. Just an aside for the art experience, for me, this made me very upset about some of the artists that my best artist friends were really down with, like Robert Smithson. This is a piece that he did about Jersey, where he was from, where I live now, where he took all these kind of interesting pictures of busted stuff and called them the monuments of Passaic. And for me, this became a real problem because it really, I think, is a model of what we can call prime moralism, which is the fact that it's fun to look at the world that humans have made and kind of pretend that it came from a time before social relations. Like before people had beef and before people had anything to say. And I feel that this kind of approach is exactly what I try to work against as an artist. Meaning that what I've wanted to always do is to try to figure out how to make those struggles and those fights visible for people who aren't in the thick of them, with the larger goal of making the world make more sense, especially for people who want to change it. So this is a really old project with some really ugly graphic design. From the year 2001. And what it's about, if you can't read it, it's about people fighting about toilets. Is anybody here ever had to fight about a toilet? Yeah, a couple toilet fighters in the house. What this specifically referred back to was a really big public fight about toilets, which happened right before 1901. Where some people who thought that working class housing was too dangerous and too nasty said, you know what, there should be a law. No longer should all the bathrooms be allowed to be in the backyard. Like if you've been to the Tenement House Museum, you might have heard about this. But in fact, we want to have one bathroom inside the building for at least every 3 families. And there was hooting and hollering and screaming back and forth, and some people that said, no one will ever build working class housing ever again. And some people said this is only just that as part of providing housing, but these basic minimum standards. And so this was installed in the window of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. It was like my first exhibit ever. You can see it here, kind of harkening back to an age where people did fight about toilets, but certainly the last line was, well, what is worth fighting about now? Like generally the toilet battles in this part of the world have been won. You could see this little fake panel discussion among people who represented diverse parties such as real estate developers, urban sociologists, rent-controlled tenants. And then at the time, it seemed really exciting as a part of an artistic practice to use the same foam mics and same name cards for an actual panel discussion about actual fights going on about housing in New York City, in this case, in 2001. That led into a larger project, which was up at the same time, called the Programmable City. This is an exhibit that was up at the storefront for art and architecture. Anybody knows that? And really, I'd say the goal in terms of the design of the exhibit was to make this kind of model city, kind of that fun experience that hopefully everyone's having right now, looking at this amazing model in front of us, where scale becomes a little bit rubbery. But in this city, the hope was that everything you looked at wouldn't just be a surface, but would somehow give way and testify to the story about all of these struggles, all of these large-scale, long-term political fights about power and space would be visible. So you could see models about the development of zoning in New York City, which was really the first time that the government ever had a whole lot to say about the size and shape of buildings and their use and where they went. And certainly this served more than one interest. I spent a lot of time hanging out at places where these ideas were actually administrated in making this work. So this is just a photo of the New York City Buildings Department in Manhattan. I got to find out about all kinds of interesting and shadowy characters. So this was a group of guys called, and this body still exists, the Rent Guidelines Board, that makes decisions every year about how much rent stabilized apartments can go up in rent. So they're called the RGB. At the time, they were also called Rudy Giuliani's Boys. I got to go to a lot of public hearings with the kind of idea on my mind being like, oh, well, back to the fun palace, right? Like we all come together, we kind of have a democratic dialogue, and then we make a decision as a group. It was interesting, this gets a little dark to the right, but sometimes, of course, these hearings happened and there were donuts and oban pan, but not much public at the public hearing. And so this raised a lot of questions in my mind about the relationship between the actual everyday administration of building codes and laws about how we build and this putatively public process. I got interested in all kinds of weird artifacts of laws, like the requirement to have ADA ramps. And then things that were just becoming on the scene now, that today seem quaint. Like this was the building that Trump built on the west side of Manhattan, the largest residential structure in the city at the time, circa 2001, but of course there's a whole other discussion about 59th Street today. So signs of the times. In this exhibit, you could go and actually hear the voices in kind of a faked talk show of many people engaged in the struggle over building codes from rent to zoning. And I'll play you a little clip. It works.
Then they are building which, what?
That sounds better than
in the city of New York, we have close to 900,000 buildings in existence. Then they are building which, built as new buildings. So all this work, doing the new buildings and maintenance of existing buildings involves compliance with building laws of the city of New York in one way or another. And we are the agency which reviews plans for approval for any kind of work, from brand new building to alteration work.
Say it's hard to really put a definition on what it is, because it is forever changing. We deal with so many different things, and they make new laws. They just made a sprinkler law in 1999, like Macaulay Culkin law, when he lit his building on fire with the Christmas tree. Remember that? They made a law, sprinkler the whole building, 4-family buildings. And we had that's a new law that you have to deal with on every 4-family house. The question comes up and you have to fight about not putting a sprinkler system in the whole building, which costs a fortune. So there are things like that, the companies like that come up with an earthquake code they made a few years ago, which maybe they asked for once in all the jobs on time. That they, you know, they made a big call, they made a whole thing, and they were making a big deal about it, and they seem to have pretty much forgotten about it since they did it. So it's, somebody would read through it and see they think it's a real big deal, and it hasn't really come into play.
This is the official book of for many programs. The number is 4350.3 HUD handbook. In this book, yes, would you believe this? This is not an easy read. Make no mistake about it.
So by the way, I don't know if Damaris Reyes maybe in here. But shouts out to Marie Christopher. She's no longer with us, but she was an amazing woman. The final part of this project that I wanted to show was this poster, which was kind of the beginning of moving beyond exhibitions, at least for me and for the organization that all this work was done for, called CUP, the Center for Urban Pedagogy, which is a thriving adolescent organization today. Not in its behavior, just in its life cycle. And what this was a partnership with the Met Council on Housing that for many years had an 8.5 by 11, many times photocopied sheet about your legal rights as a tenant in New York State. And all of this project that we added as artists and designers was simply taking this good old modernist graphic design grid by Joseph Muller-Brockman and redesigning the same content. This was something that we could sell in the gallery and then distribute for low cost or no cost to advocacy organizations. So now I thought I would talk a little about urban renewal, since that's in the title. From the building codes projects and the things before that, I had begun to get a tiny glimpse, although mostly it seemed kind of an absurd and funny thing to me, about how these systems of power worked when it came to the built environment and the spaces where we live and work. And one of the things that I heard again and again, I actually used to work spitting distance from here at the Olmsted Center in the Parks Department, is anytime you design something that someone didn't like, the main thing that they'd say about it is they'd be like, that's just like urban renewal. Or they'd say, you know, that's just like the 60s again, as a way to disparage and to discount what you were saying. And so I became really curious because sometimes people would come in and see a certain kind of design and they'd say that, and sometimes they'd come in and see something totally opposite and say the same thing. And so when I first saw this Urban Renewal logo with the arrow going up and the arrow going down, I said, like there is something dialectical about this, and I wanted to know what it was. And of course, going back to the sheer destruction that I listed before, that I think you'll see more about in the New York movie in the next program. So there is another quote. Sure, is that going to be better? Oh, okay. Hello. It was somehow just deeply shocking when I first learned this, that something with such a cheerful name like Urban Renewal was in fact the name for this horrible fascist operation. So I knew about that, and also as an architect, you began to catch up strands of urban renewal. Like this was a project on the right done by the Museum of Modern Art, where they invited 5 Ivy League architecture teams to come and imagine that they had the power to destroy a huge section of Harlem and redesign it as they saw fit. One of the renderings from that project on the left, from the Princeton team, that thought it would be really visually dramatic to contrast the overland line of the 1-9 over in Harlem with a brand new all-white city. So for those of you who don't have much familiarity with urban renewal, this is a little cartoon that I drew to give you, at least on paper, what they said it was. So the steps, first there's this blight detector. So blight, you can read about it up at the top, was detected by a city. The second step was the city could go and tell the federal government about all the blight it found inside of itself, and they could get 2/3 of the price paid for buying that land that was blighted and leveling it. The third step is that they would then buy the land. The fourth step is, of course, sometimes there were people there, so they had to be taken care of somehow. The fifth step was to knock everything down. The sixth step was then to sell the land to a private developer, who in theory of it, the place would be redeveloped, and you would have what people sometimes cheerfully thought of as the city without a hill. Probably I don't need to go into it to to explain that there's a much more sinister reading of the city without a ghetto, which was why that was the name of this project. Going a little bit more into urban renewal, things got even more confusing. So on the left here is a brochure that says Urban Renewal, a socialist scheme to confiscate private property. So your John Birchers, your far-right people were very concerned about this new development of what they saw as government overreach. Whereas on the right-hand side is a book that says Urban Renewal, Bonanza of the Real Estate Business. So I was pretty confused about who was for this and who was against it. Even very famous people that we now deify as heroes took it as their target very early on. So you see on the left an ad for Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. But also people on the right. So Martin Peterson, who just passed, was a hero of the Hoover Institute at Stanford, worked for Ronald Reagan. His claim to fame was a book called The Federal Bulldozer, where he complained against the loss of freedom in the site of this program called Urban Renewal. And in fact, Ronald Reagan nominated Barry Goldwater, if you're younger than me, was a really far-right dude who really portended, some would say, the far-rightward drift towards conservative politics of our country, certainly during my entire lifetime. I was born in the mid-70s. He took urban renewal as the enemy. And so this goes back to the title. Certainly urban renewal had all kinds of bad things, but at the same time, too many people seem too eager to slam it and condemn it too quickly for this to be all just based on the facts. And so even for those of you who read every panel here and feel great anger at what this public program, allied with private interests, has done to people, and want to see some more justice, I think it's a very useful thing and something that maybe artistic practice on urgent issues can offer very uniquely. To think for a second and say, what does it mean that I'm making the same argument as Ronald Reagan? And this was part of a much larger conservative right-wing movement against urban renewal from the beginning. You know, business leaders in right-wing magazines quoted as saying, we'd rather do it ourselves. And I won't go on to these, but I became really interested in collecting a lot of stuff about urban renewal because it became plausible to me that rather than being one thing, urban renewal instead was somehow a territory where all kinds of parties with sometimes diverging and sometimes overlapping interests somehow were brought into a constellation for a short amount of time. You know, there was a visual rhetoric here, surgery for the city, for Chicago. A mainstay of urban renewal was what you see on the right here, the before and after, which, you know, the people who work for the mayor that I work for still ask for all the time to show the efficacy of the mayor, right, and transforming things almost magically. Architecture prizes were invented for it, and then the architecture itself, both of these are from New York City, served to underlie this message of the before and the after, of things being totally different, of reinventing the city, somehow getting rid of the problems that had seemed so difficult to manage. All of this was supported by the notion of the slum or blight, which I won't go into now, but you can see this cute little octopus figure that was invented to advertise it. People studied things to find blight, like the incidence of venereal disease, and a whole buttress of social science came about in order to justify the areas that were targeted for attack by urban renewal. It was argued that poor people cost us too much money, which is again something that people haven't really stopped saying. And huge sections of cities were addressed, quote unquote, through this program. So on the left you see an early map of the Slum Clearance Commission in New York City, and on the right an urban renewal map of my city, New York, New Jersey. Now at the same time all this sinister and evil stuff was going on, I also want to at least argue that a couple things worth remembering were there too. So this program, which put the federal government much more in contact with cities than maybe ever before, demanded the evolution of entire new institutions. And they came up with all these crazy looking diagrams to explain these institutions. But this really was the weaving together of new constituencies to have new debates about how cities and places should be developed. And maybe most shockingly, I think from today's perspective, especially when people say that urban renewal was a real failure of public participation, the fact that when you look in the archive, you can see that in fact, urban renewal was the first time on a broad scale of the country that it became legally mandated to have any public participation at all. And again, I'm not saying that urban renewal isn't guilty, I'm just saying that our scapegoating of it has other motivations. So all kinds of things exist that show the creation of this public voice for urban renewal. So citizen action. These are really dark, but this is this whole series of books that are meant to almost be popular education around urban renewal. The ABCs of urban renewal. The Citizen's Guide to Urban Renewal. So in this exhibition, which happened in 2003, we made a map, a precursor to this much more exciting map that's before us. And we began to look at how urban renewal as a concept actually touched the living fabric of New York City. And there's a whole history of the shapes and their evolutions, Lincoln Square and Lincoln Center in the top middle, but they start off as these kind of weird shapes, and it was almost like a Rorschach of why does this one look like a dagger and that one look like a can opener. Then as you follow the history, the sites begin to break up into smaller pieces, which is bound up in a rhetoric of the humanization of urban renewal, being more careful, and then visiting tons of places. I know Van Heerk is here. I remember driving around the Bronx with him, taking some of these photographs, to just see the actual concrete realizations of this complex program with so many complex stakeholders, looking for if there's anything for us to understand today. And in fact, there were amazing contrasts. So in the Bronx, a lot of affordable housing, some of it no longer affordable. But say on the Upper East Side, when they shut down a brewery, rather than getting housing, especially affordable housing, oh, they got a park, which is today Rupert Park, which has its own controversy in the last 10 years, which I won't mention. So all of this multiplication, all of this production of urban space, based upon these justifications of the public, the justifications of the before and after. And this went into an exhibit where we picked 5 exemplary urban renewal sites from 5 boroughs. And among other things, we made these tables in the shape of it. Because again, a little bit obsessive with the shapes. So you have Arvern in Staten Island. You have the area that Nostradamus was concerned with in the Bronx, which is another kind of counter example of urban renewal only being the evil empire. Each of these tables had a photograph of what had resulted from urban renewal. So for example, in Staten Island, they were worried about people of color coming in, too many working class people of color, so they fought urban renewal in a very long battle, and so this is what they have today, instead of more dense housing, denser housing. Atlantic Yards was just a baby controversy at the time, but it was one with very deep roots back to the 1950s. And the departure of the Dodgers from Brooklyn. So that was an animation of all the unrealized proposals for Atlantic Yards, and it ends just as Frank Gehry's project is proposed. So you get the sense of these. Some of these were actually done in collaboration with people here, against this interborough of people here. Arvern, which is still an ongoing saga in the Rockaways, and this had that good old-fashioned matcher game from elementary school where you could match 2 descriptions, and if you were right, a light bulb would up. The exhibit also tried to contextualize urban renewal among other parallel but slightly separate phenomena, like public housing. This was a timeline that traced a 30-year legal battle in Chicago that accused the federal and the city governments of only being willing to build working class and low-income housing in neighborhoods that were already poor and majority black. That eventually ended up with the Supreme Court saying that indeed that should be illegal, but by that time, most of the people who had come to be known as white left Chicago. We also had to work with students and with Damaris Reyes' organization, who was on the last panel, to look at the current state of public housing in New York City. It resulted in these posters that were on topics from the one annual required public meeting of the Housing Authority with its residents. to who runs, controls, and funds public housing. We made a short-lived TV program called PHTV. And then finally, this exhibit included something that was a real foreshadowing for me, which was beginning to look not at the former operation of political power through urban renewal, but to look at the more current system that we have, where most affordable housing, say, is funded through federal tax credits, which I won't bore you with now, but it's a very different way that power operates through the built environment. And so this was a drawing I made of about 9 different types of subsidized housing in the United States that range from what we think of as traditional public housing, red brick towers, to what was at the time the most expensive private house on the market, which was there because of something called the mortgage interest deduction. So this became this interactive model where you could press buttons and see animations of LEDs that went from government agencies to nonprofits to developers to actual housing stock. This was a part of the model about a program called Hope 6, where mostly cities got money to destroy public housing, so we didn't drop it. And so that project is the one that really failed to communicate the subject of this talk, like I mentioned. We had really tried to say, look, something sinister is going on here when everyone just wants to prove their own good intentions by slamming urban renewal. We got some really nice reviews, but most of them said, as this exhibit proves, urban renewal was really screwed up. And so that additional level of kind of critical consciousness, totally our fault. Some of the choices that we made around representation, but it really left, I think, those of us who work on this exhibit with a lot of questions. How many people here were in the last panel about Spura? A couple, okay. Well, you all will get this next part more than the other ones. This is Spura, the Seward Park Urban Renewal Area, and there was a really amazing session just before this one on this, but for me it became the subject of a series of artworks where I got to ask more of these questions about urban renewal. The name of the piece at first was Abuse of Power. And the reason I call it Abuse of Power is because this story, among others, was kind of amazing to me in talking about the irony and the naming and the complexity of power relationships that I felt that we, as people who want democratic control of the built environment, need to aspire to if we want the world we want. This was a place where some people, kind of my people, generally a Jewish labor union, had funded perpetually affordable housing, and then very quickly had decided that they wanted their government-backed affordable housing to be the last affordable housing in the neighborhood, especially as the complexion of their neighbors began to change. And so what was ironic about it to me is that this was a battle that seemed clear was being fought by maybe the middle class against the lower class in the name of defeating urban renewal. And this wasn't the first time this happened, but it definitely was for me a cautionary note about thinking that the lines around urban renewal were very simple to draw, and the dangers of drawing them too simply. So this began in those parking lots that were discussed last time, with someone looking out from what was then this very brand new hotel called Thor, the hotel on Irvington, and thinking about those parking lots. It was a self-published booklet. It took historic materials, quotations, publications, and tried to reconstellate them to tell this super tragic, but also super complicated story. This is a section where protesters against the loss of affordable housing in Spura are carrying paper skeletons. We didn't end up making any billboards out of it, but what did come out of it was a whole series of tours that I did for many years, and probably might do some more in the future, called Underground Service Alert, where on the back of this magazine you can read, just like the way they mark out utilities on the street, a series of arcane markers to mark power relationships that explain the landscapes that you walk through. And oftentimes these were accompanied by tours where we would look at historic artifacts like this one, a rendering of the police station done by a pretty prestigious architect down there. We would oftentimes be accompanied by marching musicians who came with us, because that just makes a walking tour more fun. And we would see, again, the use of public power to create what is today called the Seward co-ops. The way that it was made public about its control and its financing. We would see how after a huge section of the neighborhood was destroyed after that, there was tremendous resistance to building anything back, but certain things crept into the mix. Certain things were preserved from the beginning, especially the religious buildings. And then of course we looked at things that were projected and proposed but were never to be. Today, you just heard a much better update on this story than I could have ever given. Suffice it to say that after decades and decades of gridlock, it seems like a quote-unquote solution is going forward, and I encourage you to talk to others who know more than me about what in fact it is solving. But these are some real estate renderings of now what is projected to appear on this land in the very near future, including, as Damaris was mentioning, an Andy Warhol museum. So after all of that, for me, I just want to conclude now. What was clear was that there were certainly things to learn from urban renewal. Things on the bad side that maybe should be never supported again, but things also on the positive side, like an amazing amount of innovation when it came to institutions, an amazing amount of focus and concentration on what would it mean to have public control of the built environment. But it also seemed very clear that history had shifted, and no longer was the battle going to be against what people maybe used to call the big plans and the little people. Now somehow the role of the private market was becoming much stronger, which demanded that activists and organizers very much change their tactics from those that in some cases had served them well against urban renewal. So this was a time when I began preparing for a project that was here on this panorama. Called Red Line's Housing Crisis Learning Center. And it was very much about the financing of architecture and buildings and landscapes. I imagine little graphs going through all of our buildings. Buildings broken up into 1,000 pieces so they could be sold to the investors in a real estate investment trust. And again, kind of like building codes, through a series of drawings, tried to work out the idea of a space where these always existing relationships and flows of money and power that are always there in every building, for at least in this building, in this gallery, would be visible. So this was us cutting the ribbon, pairing that here still to this day. This is the panorama, which you all know, and this is what we got to do with it, which was put these little markers on every block in New York City that in 2008 had 3 or more foreclosure filings on it. And so not only was it something to show the extent of the impact of foreclosures on our city, but also their uneven distribution. And so these are maps from an organization today called the New Economy Project that showed the concentration of foreclosures in communities of color that actually had a little equity in their homes. This led to an exhibition then, which tried to give some beginning set of responses to people who said, well, how in the world did all those markers go? So this had things, I'll try to supplement as you can see, that delved into the history of disciplines such as real estate appraisal, which every time there's a big crisis like the one that we've been experiencing since 2008 is always somehow in the story. This large structure in the background you can see is the head of Frederick Babcock, one of the first theorists of real estate appraisal, writing around 1900. You could go in there and find some of the books that he wrote and maybe imagine what it was like to be someone whose job it is to turn buildings into money numbers. You could find portraits of regions like in Detroit, where these pictures of buildings were arranged geographically in the gallery. So one could actually begin to read how these spatial relationships are realized in the very things that we see, the surfaces of our environments. I won't tell you about all these things. There was a gigantic graph of the crime rate, simply as what it costs someone without money to pay someone with money to use their money. And just like in building codes, you can hear from a lot of different people involved in different parts of making this system that funnels and diverts and moves around the money that we use to build the places where we live. So from bank controllers to bond investors, to the person who says they invented the commercial mortgage-backed security, to the head of the Mortgage Bankers Association, who has a very amazing art collection, to architects who thought that architects could really learn a lot from hedge fund managers, and so on and so forth. Documentation from places you can go to buy foreclosed houses. Information from the 30s, when really we as a people in the US invented the mortgage as we know it now, which would not have ever been invented by the market. A 30-year low-interest mortgage was only something that was created through the exertion of public power back in the 1930s. There was a series of light boxes. It got deeply into the 1970s history of Chicago, where there was a movement begun, this was a conference in '72, of urban neighborhoods, that eventually led to the passage of laws such as the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and the Community Reinvestment Act, that, to put it shortly and to eliminate a lot of complications, mandated that banks respond democratically to the places where they live and meet their credit needs, as the law says. And finally, you heard from some people who actually did foreclose themselves. Courtesy DJ.
Recently lived in Somerville, Mass. I was a Section 8 recipient. I have been with my fiance for about 6 years. We decided.
So you'll have to go to YouTube to see the rest. And the last thing to mention about this project is that the exhibit was one thing, and as the artist I was very preoccupied with that. But what really made this project, I think, worthwhile was the fact that it was here at the Queens Museum, which has an infrastructure of community organizing with Panorama and others. And that allowed us to reach out to housing activists across the city, to come and have free drinks, to go into other community organizations like churches, to have public roundtables around what was happening, again in 2009, to give people some individual guidance and advice from legal authorities, not from me. And so the very last thing I wanted to share with you was some information about Newark, which is really just a prelude to another conversation I hope we get to have sometime. It began with a very small project, which was looking at the first urban renewal site in Newark, which had started off as a predominantly Italian-American community. It had been slated for demolition. Mies van der Rohe had been hired with a developer to come and rebuild it. When they couldn't get money to build the whole thing as luxury housing, they got money to build public housing in the middle, so it's like a Mies sandwich with public housing in the middle. Only 20 or 30 years later, they destroyed that public housing amidst a major lawsuit in Newark to force the housing authority to provide one replacement affordable unit for everyone destroyed. This is what was put in the place of the towers. And so this was a model that looked at the state of the site over many years with different ghost buildings coexisting to, again, try to give a sense of the stories that were just below the surface of this land. This new set of laws to govern what gets built in Newark and where in 60 years. And I think that one of the reasons that there are enough people to push this through is that we, as artists and designers and planners, have done a very small thing by simply writing down what we do and making it visible and hopefully making it more accessible for people to get their hands in it and to manipulate it. So from big labels on buildings that explain how federal programs work, to murals that tell the story of jazz clubs in the city. And even to our Newark bike rack, which is the first bike rack that's designed and made in the city of Newark. And so we hope it's like a little tiny piece of Newarkness, a little tiny plea for the democratic control of the built environment that's sprouting out on street corners near you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damon. Wow, Newark has been so lucky to have you, and we're so lucky to have shared a little bit of your journey this afternoon.